Thanks for clicking in. This is the one and only Foreign Orchid, and you can follow me on Twitter at Foreign Orchid. In today's video, as you can tell from the title, we're going to be talking about hate crime in the United States, especially as it relates to the Muslim population and the presidential campaign for Donald Trump. It's become a popular talking point on the internet and in news media these days that we've experienced three unique things in this presidential cycle. The first one being that there's been an increase in the number of hate crimes committed against Muslim individuals in the United States. Two, that a part of that increase is attributable to the campaign of President Trump. And three, that this increase has created a extremely unsafe environment for the Muslim population in the United States. Part of this data that they're using to support this is the 2015 FBI crime statistics on hate crimes in the United States. So, being the nerd that I am, I decided to open up the crime statistics for the last 10 to 15 years from the FBI and look to see what the data is actually telling us about hate crime in the United States. On screen now, you can see a chart that reflects the 2005 to 2015 FBI data on hate crimes in the United States. It is the total number of victims, top line, and total number of incidences, bottom line, that occurred in the United States over that 11-year span. What we can quickly pull from this data is a general trend from 10 years ago until today to decrease the number of hate crimes in the United States. However, 2014 was the lowest point in this, and it picked back up in 2015. And it is this 1-year span that has people worried. But to give us a more detailed understanding of what is going on, I have also given us a breakdown of rates of crimes per 100,000 people as the crime data is usually reflected in. The blue line shows us the rate of incidents per 100,000 people, and the red line shows the rate of victims per 100,000 people. The straight red and straight blue lines give us the average over that 11-year span. What's important to note is even though we have seen an increase over this last year, it is still well below the average for this 11-year span that we've experienced. Now, while this chart does a pretty good job at expressing the overall trend of hate crime in the United States and an unfortunate trend upwards from 2014 to 2015, it doesn't really do a good job at capturing the Muslim experience in the United States. To do that, let's turn to this chart. What this chart shows us is the total number of victims of hate crime in the United States from 2000 until 2015, blue line, and the total number of victims of anti-Muslim hate crime in the United States from 2000 until 2015, red line. There are two big things that kind of jump out at you when you look at this data. The first and foremost is that the number of Muslim victims of hate crime in the United States is actually really quite low compared to hate crime in general. And that if we were to add in the anti-Jewish hate crime in the United States, it would be something like 4 times the anti-Muslim, or anti-Black hate crime in the United States would be something 10 to 15 times the anti-Muslim hate crime. And the second point is that for the most part, there isn't a really big connection between overall hate crime trends and anti-Muslim hate crime trends, with 2 notable exceptions. The first one being the obvious one in 2001 following the 9/11 attacks, and the current one in 2015 where we're seeing an uptick in anti-Muslim crime and an uptick in hate crime in general. So to get a better perspective on what it is like to be a Muslim American in the United States, we can see this chart right here. This chart is a little bit more complex, but it's showing the total number of victims of hate crimes directed at Muslims in the United States from 2000 to 2015. The white line reflects the total number of victims, and then the 4 colored lines represent the 4 major categories of hate crimes committed. The green line representing intimidation, the blue line representing vandalism, the orange line representing simple assault, and the red line representing aggravated assault. From this data, we can see that clearly from 2014 to 2015, there has been a marked increase in hate crime committed against Muslim individuals, and that the majority of that increase seems to be related to intimidation-style criminal activities. In fact, intimidation alone accounts for about 50% of the rise from 2014. So with this data in mind, we can return to the first of the three contentions that have been going around. Has there been an increase in hate crime in the United States from 2014 to 2016? Yes. However, it is still down compared to our 11-year average. 2. Has there been a marked increase in hate crime against Muslim individuals from 2014 to 2015? Yes. And this increase is out of step with our 11-year average. In fact, it's out of step even with our 16-year average that includes post 9/11 United States. And so we now are brought to our second contention that the rhetoric of the Donald Trump campaign has had an impact on this hate crime. And so to understand whether or not that is a true statement, we should look at the Donald Trump campaign as a whole. In his campaign, there were three groups in particular that came under rather strict scrutiny. The first being the Chinese, the second being Latinos and Mexicans in particular, and the third being Muslims. The first one, the Chinese, while he attacked a lot of the Chinese government, he never really attacked Chinese people all that strongly. And so even if there was an effect from his campaign, that would probably be the weakest of the three. However, the second one, the Mexicans and Latino Americans, this one experienced a lot of rather negative rhetoric coming from the Donald Trump campaign. In fact, when he opened his presidential bid, he had that infamous line about Mexicans coming to the United States being rapists and murderers and all around bad individuals. And then, of course, at the Muslim populations, we had such notable policy ideas as the Muslim ban and a general negative rhetoric surrounding the Syrian crisis and ISIS. And so, while the first one, Chinese, probably experienced only a very little impact from the campaign rhetoric, the next two, the Latino American population and the Muslim American population, should have been experiencing heavy effects from his campaign. And so in this chart that you can see on the screen now, we can see the total number of victims of hate crimes in the United States in those three categories. The top yellow line reflecting Latino Americans, the bottom yellow line reflecting Asian Americans, and the red line reflecting Muslim Americans. And so what we can see clearly here is that the Asian experience seems to have had or suffered no impact from the Donald Trump rhetoric, which is, I guess, to be expected since it didn't target Chinese people all that particularly. But the other interesting thing is that the Latino population in the United States didn't suffer a particular increase in hate crimes. In fact, from 2014 to 2015, it stayed rather static. The only group that suffered a real uptick seemed to have been the Muslim population in the United States. So why this is important is because if we're going to be linking Donald Trump's campaign rhetoric to an uptick in anti-Muslim violence, we should have also been expecting that the similar kind of rhetoric going against Latino Americans should have caused a major uptick in anti-Latino violence. But since we're not seeing any kind of impact, it's strange to assume that it was the result of the Donald Trump campaign. Another point kind of going against this idea is that while the Donald Trump campaign did start in 2015, it didn't start until halfway through. And that for the first portion of that, it was more focused on Mexico and Latino immigrants to the United States than it necessarily was with the Muslim population. Indeed, the Muslim ban, as it were, didn't come about until late November, early December of 2015. And so even if he had some impact on the data, he only could have had an impact for a very short amount of time. And so I don't think this data can actually say that he had a noticeable impact where we can see that this rise from 2014 to 2015 is the result of the Donald Trump campaign. And so that leaves us wondering, if it wasn't the Donald Trump campaign in particular that had this impact in rising up the anti-Muslim violence in the United States, what was? And I would think that probably the best answer to that then is the various events that happened in 2015 that could have inspired a backlash against the Muslim American population. And in particular, we had two major terrorist attacks in Europe, Nice, France being the most famous one. And then there was also two major attacks in the United States. We had the man that shot up his workplace, and then the Pulse nightclub shooting. These four events kind of worked together to create a little bit of a hysteria, I think, in the United States among the population that then led to an increase in anti-Muslim violence. And this is the similar incidents that we had in 2001, where following the 9/11 attack, even though President Bush tried to unify the population and get them to not be involved in anti-Muslim violence, it didn't actually change the fact that we saw a major increase in violence against that population. So that brings us back to our third and final contention, that this rise in hate crime against the Muslim American population in the U.S. is so great that it's causing an extremely unsafe environment for Muslim people in the United States. And I think to get a final grasp on what this actually means, it's important to return to this chart. As we can see that in 2015, there were 307 victims of anti-Muslim hate crimes in the United States, and that was an increase of over 100 people in that 1 year span. But I think at this point it's important to get the perspective on what that actually means. That means that out of a population of about 3.3 million people in the United States, 307 actually experienced a hate crime. And that number is still very tragic and should never happen, but it means that their rate of crime inside that population is far below the actual normal rate of crime in the United States as a whole. And so I think it's important to keep this perspective, because worrying about the increase and hyping it up and adding to the hysteria about it is going to cause a greater amount of anxiety in that community than is actually warranted at this moment. And that news about all this increase in hate crimes against Muslim Americans might actually embolden some people to take rather drastic actions that we don't want them to do. And so we can formulate better policies and better reactions to what is going on in the United States when we keep perspective on how many people are being affected by this, rather than the kind of clickbaity, news-catching headlines that there's been a 60 or 70% increase. Because while that number is true, it doesn't really capture the true impact and scope of what is happening. And with that said, I hope this video has been informative. I hope that it's given you better insight in what's been going on, and that it is going to spark some new conversations going forward. With that said, please, if you could, like, subscribe, and comment down below. Thank you very much.